Then in 1952, this is the middle of the Korean War, 1 out of every 4 Alaskans served in the military. After Seward's folly back in 1867, Alaska in its entirety was public domain and directly administered by the military. Forts were quickly constructed at Wrangell, St. Paul Canal, on Kodiak Island, and on the Kenai Peninsula, though most of these were actually abandoned within a few years. But as explorers and soldiers and missionaries and prospectors made their way to the territory over the ensuing decades, joining native peoples like the Tlingit and Haida in Alaska's southeast, the various Athabascan-speaking hunting bands of the interior, the Ununga or Aleut of the archipelago, and the Yupik and Inupiaq speakers of the far north, the Eskimos, not just the far north, the west, the southwest, south central. Anyway, among other indigenous groups. As all these people come in together, tensions between the newcomers and the natives sometimes boiled over into conflict. But by 1880, the census still revealed an overwhelmingly native population. Out of over 33,000 inhabitants, can you believe that? Just 33,000 inhabitants, only 430 were whites, most concentrated in the capital of Sitka or in Wrangell, site of a recently active army post, with another 1,756 classified as Creole, in other words, having some Russian ancestry. But as mining operations increased in the region, so too did non-native migration. To maintain order, in 1884, a civilian government, the District of Alaska, was established, though it was very small. 1 judge, 1 clerk, 1 marshal, 4 deputies, and a handful of commissioners. The act that had created the District of Alaska also designated it a mining district, with the caveat that, quote, the Indians and other persons in said district shall not be disturbed in the possession of any lands actually in their use or occupation or now claimed by them, but the terms of which such persons may acquire title to such lands is reserved for future legislation by Congress, end quote. By 1890, a new mining town named Juneau had become Alaska's biggest city, with 1,253 inhabitants. Juneau was designated the capital of Alaska in 1906. Well, by then, gold rushes or stampedes had drawn tens of thousands more non-natives, nearly half of them originally from Canada, Norway, and Sweden, by the way, to the region, relegating the native population into minority status for the first time. Well, as the gold rush, or rushes, sputtered in the early years of the 20th century, so did Alaska's population growth. But new population centers had been established deep in the interior of Alaska, in places like Fairbanks. With passage of the Organic Act of 1912, the District of Alaska was renamed the Territory of Alaska, meaning that in addition to a territorial legislature, that's probably the biggest thing, Alaska would enjoy representation in the federal government in Washington, D.C., through a congressional delegate. Well, World War I drew many of Alaska's males away to participate in the fighting, while the subsequent Spanish flu epidemic particularly devastated Alaska's native population. Several entire villages ceased to exist as a result of the disease's ravages. By the 1930s, it wasn't gold enticing migrants to Alaska anymore, but rather fish, especially salmon. And by 1940, southeast Alaska, with its ice-free waters and its canneries and its proximity to the fish markets of Seattle, accounted for 1/3 of the territory's total population. Meanwhile, the Alaska Railroad was finally completed in 1923, among other settlements giving birth to Anchorage, That's 1914. And by the way, there's the Alaska Railroad headquarters. But it was World War II, arguably more than any event in Alaska's history, that most significantly and rapidly changed the region. World War II. In fact, even before the war, as Japan had begun expanding its empire into China and elsewhere, the US military began to build forts and airfields in Alaska. Among other things, these facilities were subsequently used as transport hubs, particularly in Fairbanks, for supplying Stalin's Soviet Union, at that time battling the Axis along the Eastern Front. That's another story. Anyway, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor then, the US military presence in Alaska had ballooned to around 20,000 troops. Well, immediately after the US entry, the military constructed the Alaska Highway, among other road building projects, finally connecting the lower 48 states directly with the heretofore isolated territory of Alaska via Fairbanks and Anchorage. In fact, by the end of the war, Anchorage was Alaska's biggest city. Thousands more soldiers were dispatched to Alaska after the Japanese invaded, occupied, and bombed a few of the territory's far western islands. We're talking here about the Aleutians, much to the damage of Aleut villages and society in general. Anyway, to house this massive influx of military, the federal government spent $1 billion on infrastructure, especially right here in and around Anchorage. After the war, demobilization reduced the military presence in Alaska to around 19,000 soldiers. But given the subsequent rise of the Cold War and Alaska's proximity to the Soviet Union, the US military remained the state's top employer. During the Korean War, thousands more soldiers arrived at bases in Fairbanks and Anchorage, their families in tow, necessitating housing and other infrastructure development. And in 1952, this is the middle of the Korean War, 1 out of every 4 Alaskans served in the military. 1 out of 4. Indeed, by the end of the decade, more than half of Alaska's population lived in and around these two cities, compared to just 15% in 1940. Almost 80% of the total identified as white by this point. Well, since 1916, Congress had debated the merits of Alaskan statehood. In 1955, a constitutional convention, such an American thing to do, a constitutional convention of 55 delegates met at Fairbanks on the campus of the University of Alaska to craft a constitution. And after 75 days, they produced a draft document. Well, early in his administration, President Eisenhower had supported statehood for Alaska, though he worried about, quote, providing adequately for our national defense needs, end quote. That's how he put it in a 1955 letter to Senator Henry Scoop Jackson of Washington State. And I'm going to keep quoting from Eisenhower. You are aware, of course, of the tremendous strategic importance of this region to our nation's defense. Our military programs and plans oriented to this region and to the threat facing us there are premised upon full freedom of federal action, both for defense and for peacetime policing action. Okay, so this is very Cold War thinking. And Eisenhower's worried that the transition to state government might impair, that's actually his word, might impair the military's freedom of movement and of action in a Cold War context. Well, over the next several years, Alaskan delegations traveled to Washington, D.C., state constitution in hand, to petition Congress for statehood and to convince the president that his worries were either unjustified or solvable. Well, their efforts worked. Alaska was officially welcomed into the Union as the 49th state on January 3rd, 1959. And today, the memorializing that event, which I'm walking around right now, stands just across this little green from the Alaska Railroad. fitting